Today we're talking about leisure and the Sabbath and work and a bunch of stuff connected around to one of our favorite authors, Josef Pieper, and we have a special guest. We'll talk to you here in a moment. Well, hello and welcome back to Elevate Ordinary. I'm your host, JonMarc Grodi.
And I'm Teresa Grodi.
And we're back with another extraordinary conversation about the ordinary pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty. Thanks again for joining us for this. Oh, and we had a great guest last time. Oh gosh, you know what? These are all out of order. I'm not sure which one that was. But we're excited to do this. We don't always have guests in the studio, and lately we've had a number of cool guests. Today is no exception. We're talking to Simone Rizkallah. We're talking about Josef Pieper. We're talking about leisure. A topic we've kind of circled around. We've talked about his virtues a lot, but today we're really going to dig into one of the things that he's known for as an author. A lot of people are familiar with that topic. I'll introduce our guest more formally here in a moment, but I want to remind you as always that if you want more information about this show or to watch past episodes or information on how you can support the show, go to elevateordinary.com. Also, download the Awaken Catholic app at theawakenapp.io, where you can access this show and other great shows from our friends here at Awaken Catholic.
This episode is sponsored by Rob Huller at Key Realty. Rob's a good friend of ours, a great guy to work with when you're looking for your next family home or your first family home. He's a good guy, cares a lot about families, a lot about Catholic social teaching, a lot about ownership, property as the art of democracy, as we've talked about on the show many times. Check him out, Rob Huller at Key Realty.
So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Teresa, to introduce our very special guest today.
I'm so excited to introduce you, Simone, because we just recently reconnected, and I love you. So I'm just really excited that you're here today. And you're up earlier than we are. So because you're out in Cali.
Exactly.
So Simone is the director of program growth at Endow. And if you guys don't know of Endow, it's an amazing resource for Catholic women, taking you through the churches. I should let Simone do this. Simone, would you like to tell us a little more about yourself and Endow and something that you're working on that you're really excited about?
Oh, well, thank you so much, Teresa and JonMarc. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited to talk to you about one of my favorite, if not my favorite topic on leisure. And the love is reciprocated, Teresa. It's a mutual admiration and love society going on over here. But yes, so Endow, I thought you were explaining it very well. Endow stands for Educating on the Nature and Dignity of Women. That was taken from John Paul II's apostolic letter, Mulieris Dignitatum, on the dignity of women. And so we educate women and we call women together to study important church documents for the cultivation of their unique feminine genius. So we create study guides to make those church documents accessible to women and then organize them into small group communities. So if you want to join an Endow group or start an Endow group, I'm the person that you would call.
Awesome. Oh my goodness. And we have a mutual friend now.
Yes.
Sister Mary Prudence Allen, who is actually in our Diocese of Toledo now. She's a retired religious sister of mercy. I had no idea she was connected with Endow. We had her over for dinner, and I was just like, "Oh, I hear you like Edith Stein." She's like, "Yes,
a little bit."
Yeah. on the Endow end of things, she's like the queen. I just like, if I ever meet her in person, I think I will curtsy or bow or something awkward where I'm like, "Hello, Your Majesty." She's our feminine intellectual powerhouse. I mean, this is her third volume, Concept of Woman, but there's three of these.
Wow.
And she's as you know, I mean, you're friends with her. I mean, you know now. I mean, gosh,
I've really enjoyed conversations with her. Oh my heavens. Yeah, she's so sharp. Yep. Yeah, and actually our baby, we knew we wanted Prudence somehow in the name, and we knew Sister Mary Prudence, but like we saw her at the cathedral for our diocesan anniversary, and it just like dawned on me. I was like, "Oh, Mary Prudence." And so it just happened.
An excellent choice. Right.
So we're going to talk about Josef Pieper's Leisure. What's the full title of that book?
Leisure, the Basis of Culture.
Basis of Culture.
Yeah.
So I've heard this through JonMarc. I have not read the book myself. So I actually looked up, have you heard of the Burrowshire podcast with Brandon Bott? Yeah, and Father Britton. So they have an episode on Pieper's Leisure. And nice. I mean, like, I'm just excited. I want to take this one quote from Father Britton because he was talking about the Greeks first. Before they got into Pieper, they were talking about leisure in the Greeks. And he said, so I'm quoting him, that when they thought of leisure, it's when they took time to embrace reality, to sit before the beauty of creation, and to contemplate existence. And that's a really beautiful frame, I think, for what we're going to end up talking, especially reality.
Right.
You know, I'm big on reality.
Well, you know, these are really at the
a lover of reality. We have to be lovers of reality.
Right.
Well, we talk about that a lot here because we're big on the virtue of prudence and Pieper's, virtues, as we talked about. And in prudence, one of the ways I like to describe it is this turning to reality. We talk about leisure. Again, it's very significant for this show where part of what we're doing here is God comes to meet us in ordinary life. That's where we have to, if we don't find God in ordinary life, in our vocation, in our marriage, in our family, in our children, then we're not going to find him because he comes to us in the ordinary life, in the vocations he's called us to. And so leisure is very bound up in that because whether or not we get leisure right is whether or not we actually meet God in those parts of our life or whether we rush past them. So I don't know really the best place to start here. How did you get into Pieper? You know, wherever you want to start with that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are so many places to start. So I feel that frustration. Certainly there's a million places we can begin, but I think what I love Pieper's book, the Cardinal Virtues as well, leisure presupposes in order to live a virtuous life, leisure is presupposed, I think. So this is it's like you said, what's at stake here? Like reality's at stake. Your experience of God is at stake. We get leisure wrong. We get our life wrong. We miss it. We miss it, and we miss him. I think for me, I read it in graduate school. I just picked it up. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I like sitting around and contemplating. What is this? So I didn't know who Pieper was. I didn't know all the important Catholic thinkers and writers at that time in my life. So I just was struck by as a basis of culture. That's a really bold claim, Joseph. So what do you let me see what this guy has to say about it. And I read the book, especially the second half on the philosophical. I read that book 9 times. Wow. And because it was I couldn't put it down, a little bit obsessive. Maybe I shouldn't have said that on a podcast. I read it.
Well, now I need to read this book. The 9 times is what got me.
It's for me as a child of Middle Eastern immigrants, it was a turning point moment. You have those moments where you're like, something in me. We were just talking about this off record. Like there's like this shift in your mindset, in your life, in your understanding. Some intellectual gap has been filled that helps you to understand yourself and reality and the world better. Reading Pieper's book was that. I was like, this is the reason. And for me, living between two cultures, so being American, so having a Western mentality, but then being raised by Egyptians, so having a very Eastern sensibility. I mean, I think the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding did a very good job of showing the tension. Yeah. But Pieper explained it to me intellectually. Why is it that in my household, in my family of origin, we valued time with the elderly, that coffee with grandma for 2 hours is not a waste of time? Or why was I in 2 extracurricular activities, but everybody else seemed to be in 15, and they were really worried about their achievements and their, and I was like, why am I not doing life right? Because I'm fine with just 2 extracurriculars. I don't, So for me, the understanding of things are the way that they are based on the fact that what you believe, what you worship will determine how you live. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning point for me, is understanding the difference between American versus Eastern,
Yeah.
Middle Eastern cultural differences.
I know one of the big points that he makes in that book is how, and this is probably, I don't know if this is true more for the Western or is it just maybe omnipresent in the world today, that the world is taken up more and more into seeing work as the lens through which we view all of life. And so even our leisure, and again, we probably should define that term a bit more here presently, but
Yeah,
you know,
sure.
our leisure time, the moments where the work pauses, that's the instrumental time. We pause and rest a little bit to go back and do more work. And he challenges that, saying, no, the work is for something that we encounter in leisure and not the other way around. And that's a pretty big paradigm shift, you know.
Yeah, he makes there are these distinctions between like, there's like work in our life, there's entertainment and amusement, which often gets confused with leisure.
Right.
And then there's leisure itself. So leisure is seen as something very flaky, like, oh, I'm too busy and important to worry about leisure. And if I kind of need a break in order that I can go back to work more effectively, because you hear this in like, you know, if you take breaks, then you'll just be a better worker.
Yeah.
Like, hey, so, you know, so I think you're right. We need to define it. So leisure, the way that Pieper defines it, and Pieper's a Thomist, and, you know, obviously he talks about the Greeks and the Aristotelian definition of leisure, but it's a mental and spiritual attitude of being open to reality. So it's good that we started with reality. It's a spirit of calm and of receptivity to reality. So that's not the same thing as like turning on Netflix and just like zoning.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
I really struggle with that, especially since we don't have a ton of babysitting. So like when we have our time together, we do tend to like eat chicken wings and sit on the couch and watch TV. You know, and that is a struggle to be like, let's get all the kids outside and play a sport together or go for a walk in nature, when I know that the Netflix always leaves me still restless, you know?
Yes. And you can go on your walk and still not be in leisure.
Yeah.
You could, you know, that's
especially with 5 kids.
Yep. Yeah.
Cars.
I don't have a solution to that. That.
Sorry.
I mean, it's. Right. I think it's a struggle even for single people who don't have children. Mm-hmm. Our culture worships productivity, efficiency, work. You know, human beings are economic subjects at their core. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe we wouldn't say that out loud, but certainly John Paul II thought that and thought that was the reason. You know, the 20th century.
It is certainly how we make decisions, right? So if you're a head of a corporation or you're in a government office, you're seeing people as commodities, as economies, and you're managing them. Like it's across the board political. This isn't like one political side over the other. It's just when you're in a place of higher education, you have a higher education and you're in a power of authority, the only way that you can deal with people is by seeing them as some kind of commodity. And I think it's really interesting that the ancient Jews, God gave, when God was giving them, you know, taking them out of Egypt and all that time. See, I'm a biblical scholar here. All that time that God was taking them out of Egypt and retraining them, he was very serious about not numbering things, not counting things, not knowing how many armies you had, not knowing how many sheep you had, not knowing how many cattle you had. And I think he was trying to break that habit in people of commodifying everything rather than living in a clan or a family clan or seeing life in that particular lens.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. That's fascinating. And I was, you know, on that subject of the Israelites and the Jews. I mean, I think I was very, very struck by, obviously the third commandment is my favorite commandment. If leisure is my favorite, you know, virtue to talk about, because it's the protection of our humanity. It's the one day that we set aside to say that I'm not just a math problem, or I'm not just an economic subject or commodity or a product of the state. I am a human being and I have dignity. And so, I mean, growing up in Los Angeles, I remember the Orthodox Jews that would like stop, you know, like life stopped and they would be walking to their Shabbat dinner. And I love to see that because it really was like the preference of God. We're inconveniencing ourselves and stopping everything to remember that we belong to God and that we have dignity in who we are, and that there's no government or state or job or any project that's going to come before my human dignity.
Right. Yeah. So again, we accept this as normal, but we don't often think about the weirdness of like, so why does God insist that we take a Sabbath? You know, from the beginning, why does God insist that because we don't work, at least consciously, we're not working for selfish reasons. We're doing good things because we believe that they're good. You know, we're like Martha, we're anxious and worried, but because we're trying to do good, why in the midst of that does God insist, okay, you've done enough work on this day, you're not to work? And instinctively, especially in our modern minds, we think, well, God, wait, but I could get more work done. I could do more good. I could do more of the good things you've called me to do.
My husband is actually home that day, and I can accomplish things.
God says, no, you shall keep the Lord's day holy. You shall have leisure. And the gospel, story I mentioned there that helps me to understand this dynamic most is the Mary Martha thing, right? Because it's the distinction in that story is not so much that, okay, well, she prayed and she worked and one is good, the other's bad or less or something like that. It's that in Mary, she was in leisure at the foot of Christ. She was open and receptive to God in that moment. And it's not that we can do that all the time. We have to go out and work. But the issue with Martha is that there's a quality we learn in our leisure time that's supposed to follow us out and become our attitude that we carry even into our work time. And she had lost that. She had lost that peace, that presence, that receptivity in her work, in her busyness. And the point for us is that we have to find that in our leisure. Otherwise, our work, our desire to control and to make it work and to do so much good, that takes over even our leisure, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really crucial point. You cannot actually enter Sabbath rest or Sunday. Pieper says that leisure, the height of leisure is festivity and worship. Yeah. Well, you cannot worship well if you haven't done what you just described, JonMarc, which is that you carry that mental and spiritual attitude of receptivity, of openness to reality and to God in everything that you're doing in the days leading up to Sunday. So whether you are having a Mary moment and resting, or a Netflix moment, or you're working, because leisure is a virtue, you have cultivated that capacity to be open to reality, ultimately that meaning open to God, even when you are working really hard throughout the week. But keeping that receptivity, making it a habit, means that when you finally come to Sunday, where you really don't have to do anything, you have that emotional bandwidth to actually worship well and to celebrate well. You're not preoccupied, and that's the opposite. You're not preoccupied with like, shoot, with the laundry sitting there, or with you've really like given into it.
Well, talk about that distinction again, because this is the struggle I think we often have. We recognize this a little bit intuitively, but then oftentimes the time that would be leisure gets filled up with Netflix or something like that. Yeah. Like, what's the distinction? Like, talk a little bit about what really cultivates that virtue of leisure and those things that maybe seem to on the surface but really don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Teresa, when you were talking about restlessness, I think that's kind of the measure. Mm-hmm. For me, the measure is like, even when I'm in moments of leisure or in moments of rest, my mind is still elsewhere, is preoccupied, it's distracted. I'm not like fully present. Maybe I'm spending time with my mom, and she can tell, and we can all tell when someone's like, look, it's our day together, it's our leisure day together, or whatever, and you're just not really there. Just because the virtue hasn't been cultivated to the point where you can really be present to reality. I mean, this is very similar to Saint Therese saying like the present moment, like, God is in the present moment. So it's habitually growing into that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think the way to cultivate it is quite difficult, because what it is, it's not just saying like, I'm going to book an hour to play the violin. Right. Although, yes, it also might mean booking an hour to play the violin, or like shutting down the laptop. But the way that you approach that, or how you grow into that, is when the virtue itself, like you yourself are becoming the sort of person, like being virtuous is becoming the kind of person. So that even when you're not technically in leisure, that you're still a leisurely person, and that attitude of calm. And you see this with holy people, you know, whether they're working or resting or watching Netflix or doing it, they have a certain openness to the person in front of them, or an openness to reality, or a certain calm, an interior disposition where they can respond. And then I think back to your point about prudence. I mean, this is what makes the possibility for prudence to be happening. If you're going to really have cultivated that virtue of discerning the true good in every situation and how to respond to it, that presupposes that you are able to be open to what's really happening here and now. And that can't happen without leisure.
Yeah. I think bringing the virtue stuff into this is so important. There was a great, a buddy of ours here on Awakened Catholic on his show, Physically Spiritual, talked last year sometime about meditation and anti-meditation. And he was sort of talking about how, you know, when we meditate, you know, whatever form that might take, you know, sitting with the scriptures or whatever it is, well, what are we practicing? What's the virtue? We're practicing leisure. In other words, what we're practicing is focusing on one thing. In fact, in the story of Mary and Martha, that's kind of the language there. Mary, she was doing the one thing needful, whereas Martha was anxious and worried about many things. In meditation, we practice being present to one thing, just this scripture, or just being in the presence of God. And that's hard because we're used to just being scattered. It's bringing ourselves to one thing. But by contrast, so many aspects of our lives are constantly training us in the opposite. You know, to be multitasking, to be watching something while we're listening, while we're on our phone. Like, we're always practicing being fragmented. Whereas leisure is this habit of being one and present to one person or one task, and be absorbed joyfully, peacefully in that one thing that we're doing.
I'm so glad you said that, because that's it's so contrary to our American, or I don't know, Western, the way we've habituated ourselves. I mean, and I think women in particular who are so good at multitasking. I mean, when I started taking this virtue seriously, as growing in virtue feels like death. I'm like, I will wash the dishes until they are all washed. And because my tendency is to be like, oh, I'll wash a few, then I'll go change the laundry, then I'll you know, and what you were talking about, the scattered, and I'm like, okay, there's not a moral issue here, but if I want to grow in that habit of not being scattered, of being attentive to what's in front of me, I must, in these very little, humble, painful ways, force myself to slow down and be completed. I mean, this is not flaky work.
This is like Teresa therapy right now. I'm just sitting here, you know, because it's not like, so I'm type A, and I am a huge multitasker. So I waitressed for 10 years, and in waitressing, you need to multitask, but when you know your job well enough, it's very peaceful. You know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And you're, But then moving into motherhood and trying to carry over multitasking, like human beings, it's very, very difficult. And so like I really fluctuate between peace and the ability to hold my calm, and things don't, you know, really see what matters and what doesn't in this moment, and put and just like flat out, like, I need everyone away from me because I don't even know how to like get through this moment without freaking out.
Right.
And it is it's hard, you know? So I'm listening to you guys. I'm not contributing. I'm listening.
No, I mean, that's so real. You're just, when people say leisure is like flaky, I'm like, you have no idea what it means to build virtue. It is death to self, death to ego, death to your desires, death to original sin that like really does want to live fragmented and scattered.
And death. But the thing is like, I used to hear death and I would be focused on death and suffering. But as I am a mother and I die more in ways that I don't choose, like the resurrection is real. It's real and it's present in my life. It's not just this resurrection that will come someday for my body, you know, when I'm already in heaven sometime. You know, it's like when I die and I'm faithful, I can expect there to be a resurrection. And usually that comes in like I use this phrase a lot, but like God's divine creativity, then all of a sudden like issues forth from me, you know, or from whoever is practicing the virtue, whoever is dying to self, whoever is being obedient. And you look like this fertility goddess or saint, you know, like ever calm and patient and, you know, saint. But I mean, I don't think people see that like the death and resurrection is real. This isn't just you're a perfected person in this moment. You have died, and this is God spilling forth from you, you know? Yeah. So I'm hopeful as I'm listening.
And the goal of, I mean, in virtue in this life is that eventually, like if you can start to enjoy it, right? Mm-hmm. So we don't, I mean, that's kind of height of virtue, is that you're not just in a good habit, but you enjoy it. So I remember when I started taking the vice of gossip seriously in my life, I was like, you got to knock this off, right? I mean, you know, there's progression, stop doing it, but wish I was doing it, you know, wish I was gossiping, you know, it's like, oh, it's so juicy. Don't call your mom because you are not virtuous enough to resist, right? So there's that. And then all of a sudden I found, much to my surprise, right, the resurrection moment you're talking about, like, oh, I actually enjoy not sitting with my tongue. That's great. I enjoy it. And almost like surprise, like, oh, so the virtue thing works, you know, but it's not easy at first, you know, and most people land somewhere in the middle, right? They're either in the bad habit and feeling guilty, or they're in the good habit and wishing they were doing bad, right? But like, you know, at least with vice, you enjoy being bad. With virtue, you enjoy being good. But we want to get to that where we like the good things, right? Yeah. Our affections have been ordered as such that we enjoy goodness. Yeah. But it takes time. Virtue takes time. So you have to start now. So if anybody's listening to this, like, yes, I am restless, scattered, impatient, you know, I'm not open to reality. Where is God? Well, you've got to be pretty violent with yourself and cut out anything that is keeping you, you know, away from what the scriptures say, you know, with the Mary and Martha, keeping you away from the better part. There's a better way.
Yeah, when you were talking about American work or something like that a long time ago, I was thinking about this 401k issue that I'm always thinking about. Okay. I'm always thinking about the monetary systems that we just kind of fall into. And one of the biggest realizations for me was that I was saving the habit of living fully until I had saved up enough to live fully, as opposed to in my productive life, in my productive years, when you are young, you are fertile, you are able to build things, having my full earned wages available to my building, you know, to our family, whatever our family wants to do and what we want to build, and how we want to include our community and the rest of our family and what we're building. And like the idea that I'm just saving this for later.
The deferred. You're always either proceeding towards the virtue of leisure, or you're deferring it, right? Because we all like, why are we working? Well, somehow, someday we're gonna like relax and spend time with family, but that's always later, until
it's so weird, because it's so, when you're on your deathbed, you're gonna be like, you know what I wish I did? Wish I worked more overtime. I really didn't, you know, I mean, like that, having that kind of eternal perspective. I mean, I've done a few talks on leisure, and you know, in a very unleisurely preparation way. And I, you know, my mother, who's always the voice of truth in my life, she's like, you know what would be cool? If you just were leisurely instead of lecturing on it. I'm like, ouch. There's a truth bomb there. So I was like, I can no longer talk about this until I have progressed a certain level, you know, but that, you know, that's your mom for you. You know, just being, you know, it'd be cool. Just being leisurely. So,
It's so,
well, it really is a paradox.
It's so hard. Sorry.
It is. And in Middle Eastern people, it's built in. It's built into you. You're like, I mean, unfortunately, Christians are persecuted in Egypt and most places in the Middle East, but like God is still part of the culture. So like there is an emphasis on leisure, precisely because God is part of the conversation, you know, and that's what Pieper points out so well, that culture is from the root word cult. So what you worship determines how you live.
Right.
So if God is a value in the culture, then you're going to live according, at least closer to what he wants for your life. And that's really hard for Americans. That's very hard for me. We're so self-determining and individualistic, you know, economically driven. That's very difficult. But I worry about, I worry about the church. Does the church look more American, or does it look more Christian?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I think, another place where I'm always talking about the virtues, because I see them as this huge gaping hole in our modern catechesis, and precisely for this reason right here. Right? We can talk about, you know, the faith and the content of the faith, but if we don't actually have the virtue of being able to attend to God in prayer. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you can be out on a nature walk and not be at leisure. Well, you can go to prayer and not be at leisure. I think we do this all the time. We go to prayer and we're anxious and worried about many things, and we talk the whole time, and we never actually let God be there and talk to us.
I mean, preach, brother, preach. I mean, it's infuriating. I mean, the lack of virtue formation, like really understanding what it means, that's missing. Leisure, certainly in Catholic culture, I'm going to just be bold and say American Catholic culture does not cultivate leisure, doesn't cultivate interior life. But we love lots of parish programs. We love to busy ourselves up with all sorts of distractions, and they're good distractions, right? They're Catholic, gosh, but like, you know, I'll be what you just said. I just last week I was at adoration and having a nice conversation with God, and somebody walks in and turns on Gregorian chant. Well, I love Gregorian chant. I wish it were more in masses, but there's silence at adoration, and that woman, whoever she is, God bless her, interrupted people's silence and conversation and hearing God's voice, because we have to have music on. Now, it's good music, but still distracting from prayer.
Yeah. I just recently, I'd been going through my past births and trying to think of how I wanted to go into labor and delivery this next time. So this is going to be a home birth. My last one was a home birth, but the rest were in the hospital. And my pregnant brain is going to do this. It's going to make me lose my train of thought. Well, just realizing that, like,
probably
totally
you want to be present to it. So you've been thinking a lot about how it's going to be open.
Yes. So
rather than trying to distract yourself, you know.
Yeah, like I don't want to plan this time. Like, I've had 5 babies. I know what can go wrong and what can't go wrong, you know. And I really just wanted to, like, not be watched, not be distracted, have it just be a normal day, and just kind of, and I felt so at peace with that. It took me a long time to get there, and a long time to work through all the plans I had for every birth and water birth and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And just to be like, if I really actually believe that my body is meant to do this and that it's going to have a baby, then I'm just going to let it have the baby. And I'm not going to impose all this extra program because I know the science, because I've read all the studies, and, you know, like, I'm really into birthing and birth science, and, like, you know, it was just such an added burden. And I haven't had this baby yet, so I don't know how it's going to turn out, but it like freed so much of this anxiety and pressure. I'm
amazing. Amazing. You're just like, your heart's crying out for just simplicity, the essential reality. And we just love to burden ourselves with all sorts of unnecessary, programmatic, distracting things in the name of feeling secure. So I'm like really moved by this little shift for you, Teresa.
I am too. And if our couch will finally arrive on time, I will feel so much better about going into labor in my living room. So
Yep. Yes.
Sorry.
You're
really
amazing.
good at taking us off topic. Can you bring us back to topic, either of you?
I mean, JonMarc, I have some ideas about things we could talk about, but please.
Go
No,
I
I just don't want anybody listening to get discouraged, because it is so hard. And I think if you're listening and you're thinking, okay, I'm trying to understand what leisure is. So leisure is a mental attitude, a spiritual attitude of openness to reality, of openness to God. How can I start to do that? Well, I would say the first thing is to just slow your life down. Slow your life down, cut out what's not essential, and then really do carve out time for prayer and also leisurely activities. And keep in mind that the measure is like the level of preoccupation and distraction in activities. And I think we all know when we're not enjoying life because we are so preoccupied, distracted, busy. We're not experiencing the beauty of God every day, and we really want to. But again, don't get discouraged. Virtue takes work, and it takes a long time because it's a habit to start to make those choices. I mean, a dear close friend of mine finally came to the point of like, I do need to take this seriously. I'm wasting my life being busy for a job, and she's like, I'm giving myself 1 year to understand what is the new normal with how to live. And it's very, like you were saying, Teresa, it can be really uncomfortable at first, like making this decision to throw out the books and throw out the programs and throw out the plans and just say, I'm going to get back to basics here. But there is a lot of resurrection, trust, joy moments in just surrendering and trusting God in that. And I think keeping in mind also the contrary vice to leisure, which Pieper describes as acedia or sloth, which is the definition of our culture. I mean, would you agree about that?
Totally. When we talked about actually that point, we've talked a little bit about before here about sloth, right? Sometimes people hear sloth or acedia and they're just thinking laziness, right? They're just thinking non-work, but it's much more nuanced than that. It is the opposite of leisure. If leisure is attending to reality and not just doing it once, but having the habit of being open, attending to reality. Well, acedia is all the many manifestations of the ways that we try to constantly keep reality at bay. And it makes us anxious. It makes us feel horrible. It doesn't actually, contribute anything to our life, but yet we constantly try to hide from reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And to me, this culture is acedia screaming. Yeah. I mean, the word means lack of care. Acedia or sloth means lack of care. Yeah. How many self-care books and I have one. I just bought one. I got sucked in, right? How many? I spent $40 on a stupid self-care journal, which I secretly love, but still, I mean, every time I see like self-care stuff, I'm like, that's because the self-hatred's so high.
Yes.
This lack of care, even the secular culture knows something's wrong, and it's creating more economic products to sell to us to fix it. But when the point is exactly the opposite. But yeah.
Well, you made me think again, speaking to the person who's maybe saying, well, this sounds great, but but even slowing my life down and trying to practice this more, but my life's too busy and these bad things are happening and I got a lot of stuff. So how can I reasonably practice this? Well, I have an answer, but you talk about that first. What would you say to that person? Like, I can't slow my life down. I can't, all these things keep happening to me. How can I be leisure? How can I have leisure?
Yeah. I mean, I think one way to approach it with this person is, if they're a Christian and they believe in God, then, okay, like God wants you to enjoy your life. Yeah. Like, I don't know if you guys listen to Joyce Meyer, that, Bible preacher, Protestant woman, Bible preacher. I just love her. I love her so much. She's a hoot.
Right.
And she's, and she says, you owe it to God to enjoy your life. You owe it. And she doesn't mean it in a superficial prosperity gospel-y way. You owe it to God to enjoy your life. And you want somebody fancier? St. Irenaeus, newest doctor of the church, right? And he gets misquoted a lot. The glory of God is man fully alive. But the actual quotation is, the glory of God is a living man, and the life of man consists in beholding God. So if my life, my joy is contingent on beholding God's face, which is another way of saying that I'm open to reality, and God's glory is contingent on me becoming alive, living the abundant life that he created me for, then I might want to start to put away the excuses of like, well, it's just all so busy, because God created you and he owns all your time. Yeah. So.
Well, and leisure is, and again, this is the crucial thing here, is that like that Sabbath time, that leisure, that's the crux. If you don't do that, then yes, your life is going to be increasing work and anxiety and disintegration and feeling fragmented and like Bilbo, feeling like your butter spread over too much bread. that's going to get worse and worse. And it's not because you have too much. Actually, it's so funny. Whenever Teresa comes to me and says, we have too much on the calendar, I always remind her that, hey, we've been here many times before with more things on the calendar. It's not that we have too much going on. It's that we're not connected. We've lost leisure. We've lost leisure with each other, with God. And then suddenly now life feels overwhelming. That's what's at stake here. That if we don't have the habit of leisure, then suddenly everything is overwhelming. But once you have
that's
it,
perfect. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you.
No,
that's
please
perfect. That's perfect. It's not about not having a busy life. It's about how you show up to the busy stuff. Yeah. So that's sorry to interrupt you. No. You should go on. That was perfect though.
And you can,
I love it.
Even the difficult, you can begin to encounter differently, right? Even the difficult things that God allows to happen to you, those if you have leisure, you receive those differently, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, your life will be full. The saints' lives were full. Mother Teresa was pretty busy, but she also prayed and she was attentive like nobody other. She was like no one else we know in the last millennium, maybe attentive to the other person. She had a busy schedule, but she showed up completely attentive to reality and to the other person. She also prayed extra on busy days. Yeah. So,
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, because of her leisure, she was able to see God in everything and everyone. I mean, the people coming to her who were hurt, who were often ugly or stinky or just like all this stuff. Well, she could perfectly see their dignity and their love, and it's only because of what she found first in leisure, and that's what we lack. And so everything, even the things that should be a joy to us, like our children, sometimes are just like, it's overwhelming. Well, it's because we've lost the ability to see them for who they really are.
I'm at the end of pregnancy, so
yeah,
I'm like everyone. You're like, oh no, get away, we're done. Yes, I'm checking out.
Exactly.
I've got senioritis.
Well, I think that point is so important because someone listening to what I just said could have been like, oh, well, so you just want me to like delete things, so I can't do that. But no, it's how you show up. But then also, I think what happens when you cultivate that leisurely habit is then your schedule actually gets filled up with the right things.
Yeah.
And I know so many people who are tormented by like, am I doing what God wants? Am I doing, because they haven't really been able to hear what he says about their schedule. Right. So it's not that he doesn't want you to be active and fruitful, but with his projects, not necessarily with yours, and maybe some overlap. I don't know, but that's another problem with the vice of acedia. The contrary vice to leisure is that the heart of acedia, according to Evagrius, that late 4th century Egyptian monk, is autonomy. It's autonomy.
Wow.
Which is a preference of self. Yeah. So the leisurely person's like, okay, here's my desire, here's my preference, but I'm open to what you have to say about it. And then that becomes a prayer and a dialogue so that you feel satisfied with what you're spending your time doing because it's born out of a communication that you had with God about your life.
Yeah.
Wow.
I love that connection. Yeah. The autonomy or pride, I think, would be another way to say that, right? Pride and sloth are kind of like two sides of the same weird coin here. Huh?
Yeah. It is. One looks down at reality and says, I'm bigger than that. And the other one looks up at the reality and is like,
Yeah, because Western theology will talk about like pride and vainglory. Thomas will talk about those, but Evagrius is acedia is the deadliest of the vices. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought it was pride. What does that mean? But you're right.
You can't get out of it.
It's this battle.
It's really rational. It's like Chesterton's The Maniac chapter, right? Where you're like ultra rational about why you can't do all these things, A book that we often mention to couples and on this show is that we always get it wrong. Big Questions for Frantic Families by Pat Lencioni.
Oh, nice.
It's a quick read. It took him 2 hours. It took me 2 days. So it's different reading levels. But it kind of walks you through making these kinds of cutting out decisions as to what your mission this is for couples, like it's a couple book, families book, as to what your mission is as a family, like how you stand shoulder to shoulder with your spouse. And it's an excellent book.
I love it.
But as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about all these conversations that I have about people who want to start homeschooling. Because usually how it goes is like, we want to start homeschooling. what's the best curriculum? And people come to me and they say that. They're like, what curriculum do you use? And I mean, I'm happy to share our favorites, that we've come across. But usually what I tell them is like, look, I really think you need to de-school before you start homeschooling. You need to take time with this child that you're pulling out, or the children that you're pulling out, and do like just nothing, like go to museums and go to parks and read, find what they find in the library and read it with them, read books out loud, because in that time of not having anything on the schedule, and this is hard to convince people. People don't want to do this. They want to jump into homeschooling because it's so exciting, but it's like, you have to know your kid. You have to know how the dynamics of your family work, and you have to know what it's like to not be what is it called? The pickup line person, or all like dumping out, all the things the kid has to do for the next day, and making sure that, you have all the lunches packed and you have whatever theme day it is. Like, you need to not be that person and not be that family, and figure out what your family is for like 2 months. And if that extends into like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, let it extend into that time. That time is invaluable. We have a friend who is head of a high school, and he was like, I want to do classical education, but how do you get like inner city kids to care about classical education? And I was like, and he must have thought I was just like out of like crazy. I was like, you need to get them outside of the classroom walls, and they need to start a garden.
Amazing.
And then he was like, okay. And I'm like, no, seriously, they need to understand reality. Where they are right now is not reality. They need to come into reality and learn what reality has to teach them. And I can't think of a better way than like a garden, of how like watching something grow,
That's what Pieper talks about. He talks about
there you go.
The rose.
I'm a genius.
Teresa, you're a genius. No, I wanted to say first, you're a genius. I'm just listening to you going, she's so smart. I hope these people are listening to her. I mean, this is where the love of the Mutual Admiration Society gets enkindled. No, I mean, do they listen? Well, first, before we go and leave Pieper, do they listen? Do they listen? They need to listen, because what you're so important. They don't listen. They're like, no, I want my curriculum.
I know. And then they'll burn, and then they'll be like, oh, this is what I need to do. Because I was that person.
Father Giussani, I don't know if you've all read any Luigi Giussani in the religious sense. He's paraphrasing Aristotle, that the object determines the method. That's what you just said. You have to know your children and know your family to determine the best method. You begin with the human person. This is another way to say it. The personalistic norm that John Paul II talks about, right? Like it's the beginning, the person determines the method, not the other way around. And so much of the way that we operate, schools included, which is why kids hate school, is that the determining factor is efficiency and economics and criteria and standardized testing, not the human person. I remember I used to teach high school, and these seniors would come into class and they just so frustrated, the SATs and all this stuff. I would just look at them and go, I know that you're frustrated and stressed and pressured, but for me, this makes me very happy, because your very being is rebelling against these reductionistic forms that are being imposed on you.
I love it.
So, and if they leave my classroom having a sense of wonder, all I can say that I've accomplished is that I haven't destroyed the sense of wonder that God gave them in the first place.
Yes.
But that's what school does. So starting a garden. So sorry, back to Pieper. He'll say that there's two conceptions of work.
Yeah.
Right. And we're so used to the discursive work, right? And that is all wrapped up into what you were talking about with rationalism and Kantian rationalism and all this kind of stuff. Okay. What we can tear apart, pick apart, analyze, judge. And then there's the contemplative work, the philosophical act. And he'll talk about the example of a rose, right? So a natural scientist can take a rose and nitpick it and pull it apart and analyze it. What's the color and what's the texture? But the philosopher, the human being, can know a rose in a different way, not in a scientific way, but can know a rose in a contemplative way, gazing at its beauty, smelling its fragrance, enjoying just enjoying it. And again, it's not something that can be explained in words necessarily, but there is an education and a knowing that happens through the contemplation of the beauty of the rose. And that's what leisure is. It's a different, it's a knowing, it's a higher way of knowing, actually.
And that way of knowing can lead back to a more fruitful scientific knowing, but it can't go the other direction, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that, I mean, when you look at, Steve Jobs and the iPhone, I mean, I think the idea came to him on a walk, and again, I don't want to glorify the iPhone or all the technology, but the idea that we get these inspirations for creativity in prayer, in leisure, in wonder. That's a different kind of knowing. That's a different attentiveness to reality than what we're trained for.
Wow. And then I'm thinking of the iPhone, and I was just talking with somebody with this the other day about the new Time magazine article of do women ever have to give birth again? And they've found a way to gestate a baby outside of the mother's womb. And they focus on the goods. Okay. They focus on a child who can't continue growing in the womb and you would have to have an abortion, or, the baby would die, something like that. They focus on the goods, but they don't play out all the way in which people and systems and, capitalistic greed and socialistic hygiene, punishment, whatever, is on the other side, will take advantage of that. And as I'm sitting here thinking, hearing you guys talk about the rose, I'm thinking you have someone at leisure and then their creativity is then usurped by people and systems devoid of leisure, who, if they had leisure, they would think, oh, well, what if this was used for this horrific means?
But exactly, because devoid of leisure means devoid of prayer and devoid of humanity, which is why Pieper wrote this book in the first place, coming out of World War II. I mean, he had experienced firsthand this horrifying use of technology for mass genocide, right. So leisure isn't flaky. It can, not only can it save you from using technology for inhuman ways, because these people who are inventing this are completely missing out the human person, in their deviations, but that's the least common denominator. You're not going to do damage. On the higher end, leisure, which leads to prayer and worship, leads to creation of culture and creation of civilization, which is how we got Western and European civilization in the first place. Right. It was monks who took leisure and prayer seriously. And that birthed all sorts of practical, creative things, clocks, aviation, champagne, all the good things in life that we take for granted from a monk, right?
Yeah. Have you, what's that episode of Good Money that's the virtue that's for rich people only?
Magnificence.
I always get it confused with magnanimity.
Which is connected.
But as you guys have been talking, I've been thinking a lot about the responsibility that wealthy people in the Middle Ages, Scholastic era, whatever that is, up until whenever they didn't. Again, just Teresa, stop. But that they're one of the things that the church tells them they have to do, and that is fulfilled in this virtue, is doing big things for the community, particularly leisurely things like festivals and fireworks, and they would throw the parties for the peasant people. It's not that peasant people didn't have parties, but they would do the magnificent things that we think of today as culture. We think of as this town is a great farmer's market, or they do a great parade or whatever. But that was the job of people who had the means, was to contribute to the leisure time of everyone. You know what I mean?
And by contrast, we often focus on, when we're thinking about helping the needy in the world, well, certainly we need to help them with the material needs if that's where the need is, but we tend to look at the whole world only in terms of the material needs, and without creating space for leisure, we end up with a whole culture of people who have the material needs but are miserable, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. But what are the first things that go? It is all, I mean, because of COVID, I mean, 2 wholesome 100-year-old family-run theaters in Los Angeles have now closed, and we are heartbroken. Yeah. Because sure, it's what's going to go first, the arts and culture and leisurely things, but unfortunately those are the things that sustain the soul of a nation. Yeah. Right. And so they're so important, just as important as, I don't want to say just as important as food, because you need food to live, but I mean, it should be taken very seriously when that happens.
Yeah, I mean, look at John Paul II,
Yes,
he could have gotten killed by doing these Polish plays during the wartime. But they were that important to the continuation of Polish culture, which is like one of the strongest cultures, Catholic cultures in the world.
Yep. But because they knew their dignity. Their dignity lies in their capacity to co-create with God artistically and theatrically. And if you take that away, if you take out the reminders of that, then you really can start to lose your sense of self, your dignity, and you make yourself very much a vulnerable subject of the tool of the state. So these, it's sometimes it's hard to make that intellectual gap of like, what does theater have to do with fighting Nazis? But actually, it does.
Yeah. There has to be. One of my favorite memes on the internet is the one where it's pitting philosophy and science. It's talking about that dynamic, and the person says, well, what's the good of what good is philosophy? And the philosopher says, well, I don't know. What's the good of mathematics? And the mathematician begins to respond, and the philosopher interrupts him and says, oh, you're doing philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm bothered. I'm bothered, as I'm sure you are, that in modern days, philosophy has been reduced to just kind of like this dusty wing of the academic department.
History of philosophy, essentially.
When you learn philosophy, it's like history, rather than really philosophy in its original, more general, more practical, more full and fruitful sense is closer to what we're talking about with leisure, in the sense of you take that time to get in touch with reality.
Absolutely. Every human being has a destiny to be a philosopher. Right. Not a professional philosopher, but like to be human is to engage in philosophical thinking. Everybody's born saying, "Why, mommy? Why?" I mean, you're gonna have a baby, and you're a little philosopher baby, right? Be like, what, at some point. So I totally agree with that. I think it's so important. I think once that is understood by someone, that there's nothing more practical than good philosophy, because it determines everything, every decision that you make. Then I think there's a real freedom in knowing who you are as a human being, that you have this capacity to criticize, to judge, to know things, and that you really do want to know what's real. Yeah. And my
kids are going through a robots book right now. And they're like getting excited about building robots. And my daughter was like, I want to make a robot kitten that can go visit people in hospitals, because it says that here, like, people can't have real animals in hospitals, and that this kitten like responds to touch and responds and will act like a real kitten. And I'm not squashing her. I'm like, keep reading the book, honey. But I'm thinking to myself,
classical educator.
But I'm like thinking to myself, that would cause the person, unless they have like dementia or Alzheimer's, which you can bring in like baby dolls, and it awakens something that was there, that wasn't accessed or whatever. But if it was like a normal, rational, functioning person, I feel like they would die on the inside. Like having this, like, this is what my life means. Like, I'm pretending this fake cat, and it's like I think my life is over. Like, it would put you in such despair.
I know, but
because you have to lie.
Yes. Have we kind of done that? We've done that.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to have that image every time I think about how we've exchanged the good life for a virtual. I'm dead. You know what I'm doing right now?
Next time you're scrolling, just think of petting a virtual cat.
No, it's true. This is like the perfect image to get me to stop scrolling. I'm be like, Teresa would be like, put the cat down. It's not even a cat. Amazing. Love it. Oh, it's so true.
Oh my gosh.
So true. Right. Poor God's looking down at me like, guys, really?
I made real ones. Mommy won't let me have a real one.
So I
we have a
know.
fake cat.
Well, I love that about Montessori. I audited a Montessori catechesis, the Good Shepherd class in graduate school. And it was just so fascinating to me. You know, kids, like little kids in particular, like they want to see real ducks. They don't want to see Donald Duck. Donald Duck's not a thing for them. They want to like look at a real duck. And I remember sharing this with my mom, 10 years ago, and I was learning it. And she was like, yeah, we took you to all Disneyland, all that, but you just wanted to look at the lake, at Disneyland. And it's like, okay, but like, we didn't have to pay that much money for you to go to a real lake. Yeah. So we want reality. Children want reality. We want reality. We're made to be lovers of reality.
Yeah.
And that's what leisure does.
Well, we're going to have a mug that you can purchase through Awaken Catholic that says, I love reality.
That's amazing. I will buy it. It was Giussani that taught me that. He said we need to be lovers of reality. So it's beautiful.
Well, I think we should land here, although I'd like to talk for another couple more hours.
I know, right?
Other stuff. Perhaps we'll do this again sometime soon.
Yeah, well, I would love to share before we say goodbye. I wrote for other people out there, not for me at all, a litany of leisure and a biblical examination on leisure. So if anybody
wants, can you give us your blog?
Yeah. So, okay. So my blog is culturalgypsy.com, but you can find it on there, or you can just Google my name and it's published in the Catechetical Review on an article I wrote on leisure. You have to scroll all the way to the bottom, but there's both a litany and a biblical examine on leisure. If anybody just kind of wants a little helpful jumpstart, just want to throw that out there.
That's excellent. Oh, thank you so much for being with us. And again, I wrote it down because I'm so bad at this. You're the director of program growth at Endow.
Yes, check out Endow too, please.
Yes, I'm so excited to get going with some Endow groups here in the future. You've really spurred me on. I want to be educated like you guys. I come up with these examples and you guys are like, it's like Kant and it's like this. Like, I'd love to know that too.
Oh my gosh. You know more than you realize you do.
Thank you so much, Simone.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, and thank you for listening or watching, audience member out there. Hopefully this has been a leisurely listen to you. Hopefully it's been encouraging and inspiring to make sure that you're creating those spaces in your life. I mean, we are commanded by our Lord to have that Sabbath time in our week, but we need to make sure that it's going beyond that we're learning, we're encountering God on the Sabbath day. We're practicing the virtue of leisure. We're also doing other times too. I mean, I think elsewhere, maybe another show here, I think it was on the men's show, we talked about how there needs to be a Sabbath hour in the day. That's a daily prayer. We need to have those moments in the day when we reconnect and go back out into our work with a greater sense of presence. In our year, there should be a Sabbath time in the year, a retreat, the time when we step away and really make sure that we are making leisure the basis of our life. That's the tagline of his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture. Well, it's the basis of so much. It's the basis of everything that is good and true and beautiful in our lives. And so we need to make sure that we're putting it there. It is so crucial. So anyway, thank you again for joining us for this episode. Again, check out elevateordinary.com for information about the show and ways that you can support it. Also download the Awaken app at theawakenapp.io to follow this and other shows. And once again, this has been Elevate Ordinary. Thanks again for joining us for this episode. God bless you. Talk to you again next time.
This episode is sponsored by Rob Huller at Key Realty. Rob's a good friend of ours, a great guy to work with when you're looking for your next family home or your first family home. He's a good guy, cares a lot about families, a lot about Catholic social teaching, a lot about ownership, the property as the art of democracy, as we've talked about on the show many times. Check him out, Rob Huller at Key Realty.